Welcome back to yet another episode of your Re-Educated podcast. I'm so excited. We're on the latter half of season 10. Today we're speaking to a very special guest, Brandon Smith. He is the FRQSC postdoctoral fellow at the University of Wisconsin-Madison's Institute for Research in the Humanities. His research weaves together ancient ethical traditions and early modern philosophy to explore the nature of pleasure, health, and human flourishing. His work carefully reconsiders classical and early modern conceptions of virtue, emotion, and the body, especially through deep engagement with Epicureanism, Stoicism, and Spinoza. Challenging the assumption that ethical life must be about suppressing desire or transcending pleasure, he argues instead that pleasure is not a distraction from virtue, but a sign of health and moral understanding, an integral part of living well, both naturally and ethically. How are you doing today?
I'm doing quite well, and thank you for this opportunity.
Yeah, the season's been about meaning and pleasure, and I feel like there's been so many interesting conversations that have come from neuroscientists, philosophers, aestheticians, and so it's been really just kind of challenging my own understanding of pleasure and things. So I want to first just learn a little bit more about you. How did you find your interest researching and studying pleasure specifically?
Well, so my kind of philosophy, my beginning in philosophy was primarily learning about ancient philosophy and 17th century philosophy. And so with the ancients, for them, the core dimension of philosophy, the main aim of philosophy is how to live a good life. And they show how all the other more kind of theoretical and scientific aspects of philosophy are supposed to inform that and facilitate living a good life, living a happy, flourishing life. The term they use is eudaimonia. And so from the very beginnings of my philosophical education, I started with this idea that the most important dimension of philosophy is how it guides our path to living. That one of the most important, if not the most important question in philosophy is what makes life worth living and how ought we to live our lives in a manner that makes that life worth living, that makes it meaningful or fulfilling or satisfying. And from that kind of perspective on ancient philosophy, when I started learning about early modern philosophers, in particular 17th century philosophers like Hobbes and Descartes, Spinoza and Leibniz, I noticed particularly with Spinoza that he seemed to be doing very much the same thing as the ancients. He also seemed to primarily care about living a good life and showing how all these more kind of complicated philosophical doctrines about reality and knowledge, human psychology, how all of these things were actually intimately connected to living a good life. And so I kind of brought together these ancient ideas and then these 17th century philosophy ideas, and they've kind of carried me forward since then. And the very first thing that I noticed when it came to the relationship between Spinoza and the ancients was the fact that they both gave a central place to pleasure in their account of how to live a good life. And so I really wanted to look at the different ways in which these philosophers understood pleasure and what the different roles of pleasure were for them in living a happy life.
What is it, do you think, about I'm first curious, just historically, this question of living a good life. When did it become a central aim of philosophy? Was that in the 1700s or was that far before then?
Definitely far before the 1700s. I guess it's a difficult question because my introduction to philosophy was with the more kind of Western philosophical tradition, starting in ancient Greece and leading up to philosophy in early modern Europe. There are obviously other philosophical traditions in India and China and Japan and Korea, and in various other places on the globe. So philosophy is very much this global thing, and the kinds of methodologies and ideas can be drastically different depending on the culture. So I can't really speak to, in any kind of categorical sense, to where this really began. And in this context, I think I can only really speak to the kind of Western philosophical tradition. But in this kind of context, it seems to really begin with Socrates. So ancient Greek philosophy, or Western philosophy as we know it, doesn't begin with Socrates. It begins with earlier philosophers who are often referred to as pre-Socratics. Thinkers like Thales, Anaxagoras, Parmenides, Zeno of Elea, etc. Those thinkers, they primarily they were natural scientists. They attempted to explain the natural world, and what really made them philosophers is that prior to them, when it came to explaining the world, Greeks would usually rely on the myths, Homer's Iliad, Hesiod's Theogony. So they would rely on myth to explain the world. But Thales, Anaxagoras, Anaximenes, and thinkers like that, they were the first ones to really say, well, no, we're going to use reason, and we're really going to start to examine nature itself and start to construct our own explanations, whether or not those explanations match with what the myths say. And so for the longest time, that's what Greek philosophy was. But then with Socrates, we see philosophy the trend in philosophy shift. For Socrates, first and foremost, he wanted to question, well, to what extent do these philosophers, or he himself, or his contemporaries, to what extent do we actually know anything for certain? People can be a little too quick to assume that they know things. And so Socrates is very famous for saying that his wisdom lies in recognizing that he's not wise, and in constantly critically examining his own beliefs and encouraging other people to dialogue with him to really critically examine their own beliefs. And so Socrates thought that really we have to actually start with what does it mean to live a good life? How ought we to live? Because if we don't understand what it means to live a good life, or what good and bad are, or what virtue and vice are, how exactly can we be sure that we're approaching science in the right way? So we actually have to start with moral philosophy. We have to start with how we ought to live, and with good and bad, and make sure that we're clear on those things before we start engaging in natural science. Because when it comes to engaging in natural science, we have to subscribe to certain methodologies that we would consider correct and good or beneficial and useful. But if we don't really understand what is good or beneficial or useful with any clarity, then we can't really start that project off in a good place. So Socrates says, well, first we need to be constantly vigilant and constantly critically examining our beliefs about moral things. And once we have either a stable and certain foundation, well, then we can engage in the other sciences. Or alternatively, at least if we have certain beliefs that have consistently stood up to critical examination, even if we don't know for certain if those things are the case, as long as we have we can have reasonable faith in the truth of these things, simply because we keep critically examining them and they don't fall apart. In either case, that's a good starting point. But for Socrates, he never felt confident in giving certain or definitive or robust answers about morality or about the natural world. But his student Plato, and then subsequent philosophers after Plato, like Aristotle, Epicurus, and the Stoics, they all felt that, well, no, actually, we can, through reason, through proper rational reflection and discourse, we can actually arrive at clear and definitive answers and offer robust answers about the nature of reality and how we ought to live. And in fact, we can't give these answers about how we ought to live without first understanding the nature of reality, and in particular, human nature, how we function as human beings.
I mean, it's so fascinating to learn about these people. I mean, even hearing these names, I studied a little bit of philosophy, but I feel like I never got into any one thinker too deeply to know really what they represented and what ideas they kind of put forward. But I mean, it's just so fascinating that you can read of these people who've lived thousands of years ago, who are still thinking about really similar things that we're thinking about today. I mean, these seem to be very integral pieces of being human, and that stays consistent no matter what. And I think, to me, even just hearing you say all this just makes me feel this deep connection to the people who've come before us, and also just appreciation for those ways of thinking which have deeply impacted the way we think about things today. And so one thing I want to understand is, you brought up Plato, Epicurus, and the Stoics. And so I know a lot of your work contrasts Stoicism with, and then their beliefs on pleasure. So what, if you could just give a brief kind of overview of, it's hard to do it briefly, but what the Stoics stood for, what ideas they represented, and what pleasure meant to them.
So for the Stoics, like other ancient philosophers, like Socrates, like Plato, they were looking for, well, how ought we to live? In more particularly, what does it mean to live a happy life? What is happiness? And so a key feature of happiness, eudaimonia, for the Greeks, is that happiness needs to be something that's structurally stable. Because the idea of happiness is something that's intermittent or momentary. That's not really fulfilling. You really want to really live a good life. We want something that something that's intrinsically valuable, that you can structure your life overall around. Something that's going to give you a reliable sense of fulfillment. And so the Stoics say, okay, well, if we really want happiness to be a stable condition of living, then we have to draw a distinction between what's in our control and what's not in our control. And ultimately, what's going to give us this kind of stable condition of living, it has to be something that's in the domain of what's in our control. And when I say in our control, I mean fully in our control. Because there are obviously some things that we have partial control over, but not complete control. And the Stoics don't think that that's enough. For happiness to be a truly stable condition of living, it has to be grounded in something that's fully in our control. And for complicated metaphysical reasons that we won't get into, they land on the answer that, what do we fundamentally control? What we think, our judgments about things. And in particular, we control our value judgments about things, what we consider good and bad and morally neutral. And an important component of Stoic psychology is that emotions are cognitive. So for what that means in this case is that for the Stoics, our emotions are grounded in our value judgments. We experience fear, for example, because we judge something to be harmful and bad to us. If we didn't judge something to be harmful and bad, we wouldn't fear it. And on the subject of pleasure, we wouldn't experience an emotion of pleasure if we didn't judge that something was good and beneficial to us. But on the subject of pleasure specifically, the Stoics distinguish between our bodily pleasures or our bodily sensations and our emotional pleasures. So sensation versus emotion. Sensations are just how the world affects us, which could be in a pleasant way, an unpleasant way, or in a neutral way. So, for example, the wind moving through my hair might be something that's neutral. It doesn't really cause me pleasure or pain. On the other hand, somebody tickling me might cause me pleasure. Or if I eat or drink something that's tasty, then that would cause me sensual, pleasant sensation. But pleasant sensations are just how we're affected. They don't necessarily have to affect our judgments or what we do. Emotions are feelings that we have that actually determine our actions, that motivate us to do things. So just because drinking a bottle of Coke might be pleasant for my taste buds doesn't in itself mean that I have to consider that sensation a good thing, a bad thing, and it doesn't necessarily have to mean that I should drink Coke in the future or avoid Coke. It's only if I experience that sensation and then make the judgment that this was a good thing, that I will then go from experiencing not just a pleasant sensation, or not just experiencing a sensation, but experiencing a full-blown emotion, a full-blown emotional pleasure. And that emotional pleasure will then will guide my actions. In this case, it will compel me or encourage me or motivate me to drink Coke in the future to experience that sensation again, because I've judged it to be important. So ultimately, the Stoics say that happiness has to be based in is based on our judgments. And to live well, we have to make rational judgments. We have to make correct judgments about what is truly valuable. And so because they place happiness in what is in our control, fully in our control, the Stoics ultimately argue that really the only thing that's truly good is our capacity for reason and reasoning well. So for the Stoics, the only thing that is truly good, that is actually good, is reasoning well, judging things correctly. And the only thing that's bad is reasoning poorly, making erroneous judgments about the world and about the value of things. Everything else, including our bodily states and our material conditions and social prestige, everything outside of our mind is ultimately morally indifferent to that. Because ultimately, those things are not fully in our control, and so they can't ground happiness as a stable condition.
I feel like in the little that I've explored in Buddhist philosophy, I feel like a lot of these things I think I've heard in that as well. Just this idea that how you respond to what happens around you is what causes the state, rather than something intrinsically existing in those states around you, which I find to be so. I mean, I think this is really interesting. And so in this kind of setting up, it looks like pleasure just happens to be one of many responses. Is that what it is? Like when you experience something and you're like, oh, this is a good thing, this means a lot for my family, or this means something for my prestige, you've experienced some sense of pleasure, and so it's just something that arises and passes, but it's not something necessarily to be aimed for in the Stoic kind of.
Yes, for the Stoics, while their kind of hierarchy, or while their classification of values can be a little can be counter to common sense and counter to our intuitions, when it comes to pleasure itself, they have a fairly commonsensical view on the value of pleasure. So sensual pleasures are neither good nor bad. They're morally neutral. But when it comes to pleasant emotions, well, pleasant emotions can be good or bad in terms of whether they're based on healthy, correct rational reasoning, or whether they're based on unhealthy, incorrect reasoning. So for the Stoics, pleasures are not inherently good or bad, depending on whether we're talking about pleasant sensations or pleasant emotions.
So I think the really fascinating stuff is oftentimes I grew up in a around a lot of people who, never studied philosophy, never heard of these things. And so when I tell them, these are the things that I'm interested in, or I care about these things, these questions, oftentimes the question becomes, well, how do these beliefs actually impact the things that are happening in our lives? And it so deeply so, I'm really curious at this particular period, how did the beliefs that the Stoics had about pleasure end up influencing how people not in academia or not philosophers, how did it impact just the normal person's life?
Well, so an important thing to keep in mind with ancient philosophers like Epicurus and the Stoics and the Cynics and the Pyrrhonian skeptics, Hellenistic philosophers, is that they had they treated philosophy as a way of life, and they had philosophical schools where they actually tried to encourage people to join them. And part of the way that they encouraged people to join them was they tried to speak to the average person's, they tried to speak to the average person in the average person's language on their terms. So instead of giving someone a philosophical treatise on why they should approach happiness this way, they would actually speak to you based on the social role that you had, based on who you were as a person. So most of us, I think, have this natural inclination to enjoy pleasant sensations. So for the average person that they were trying to recruit or convert, so to speak, they would hone in on, well, what kinds of things do you tend to enjoy? And someone might say, well, I enjoy drinking beer, or I enjoy this particular delicacy. And they would start by honing in on that and explaining, okay, that thing's very pleasant, but do you have complete control over your ability to have that thing? And most often, people are going to say, well, no, because you can't always have the exact kinds of foods or drinks or the exact kinds of external objects that you'd like, because life can get in the way. There's all kinds of external factors. Maybe you end up not having enough money. Maybe the shops don't have that particular thing. Maybe because this is ancient Greece, maybe your particular city-state is entering a war with another city-state, and so everything's very chaotic at the time. So they would hone in on the fact that, well, that doesn't really seem to be something that you can stably have in your life. And when you don't have that thing, how do you end up feeling? You end up feeling miserable. You end up feeling frustrated, angry, and upset. Well, that doesn't really seem to be a good way to live your life if you place your values, if you place the quality of your life on things that are not in your control. So the way that the Stoics and other Hellenistic philosophers would speak to non-philosophers is actually by trying to speak to non-philosophers on their own terms and actually spread that philosophy to them.
I mean, so how do we kind of transition from Stoicism to what comes after? What is like the next major shift in how people start viewing pleasure?
So I guess this isn't specific to pleasure, but the next kind of major shift that we can talk about here is medieval philosophy, the rise of the Abrahamic religious traditions, like Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Well, in the medieval period, we actually see this ethical focus on living a good life, on happiness, continuing into the medieval period with religious philosophers like Aquinas and Augustine and Maimonides and Averroes. But the interesting thing here is these religious philosophers, they actually liked a lot of what the ancient philosophers were saying. The ancient Greek philosophers were saying, but they were pagans. They weren't Jews. They weren't Christians. They weren't Muslims. They didn't believe in the one true God, so to speak. So what these religious philosophers ended up having to do was synthesize the elements of the ancient Greek philosophers that they liked, they felt were true, and then synthesize them, combine them with religious truths about God and piety and the well-being of the soul over the well-being of the body. And so this connects in with pleasure because with this kind of greater focus on spiritual well-being over bodily well-being in a way that in some respects it's not completely different from what the ancients had in mind, because they also were focused on well-being of the mind, the well-being of the soul, with the body either being a lesser good or, in the case of the Stoics, a morally neutral thing. But there was this kind of greater focus on not just the well-being of the soul in the here and now or in this life, but then in another life as well. And so we end up with these fascinating Jewish, Christian, and Islamic philosophies that very much talk about God and spiritual well-being, but they end up explaining the nature of reality and human nature in ways that Aristotle or Plato in particular would understand them. The Stoics were not as popular, at least amongst medieval philosophers. When we get to the Renaissance period, we do end up with a Christian thinker like Justus Lipsius, who actually does take the Stoic views on what is up to us and what is not up to us and divine providence, and combine that with Christian doctrines.
And so this kind of merging of the philosophies that occurred during Stoicism, that period, and the Abrahamic religion merged more during the Renaissance?
Well, during the medieval period, and then it continues in the Renaissance as well. But what we end up with in the early modern period, in particular in the 17th century, is we start to see new scientific developments. And new scientific developments end up revealing that the ways that previous philosophers, particularly philosophers who follow Plato or Aristotle, or follow the ancients more generally in explaining the world, these new developments in science actually seem to conflict. So it was a common view in antiquity and in the medieval period that the universe was that the cosmos could be understood in a geocentric way. That is to say that everything revolves around the Earth. But then new scientific developments from Copernicus and from Galileo started to reveal, well, actually, it seems like everything revolves around the planet. Everything seems to revolve around the sun, not around the Earth. But Aristotle told us that everything revolves around the Earth. So how are we supposed to square that with these new scientific developments? Well, it starts to seem like actually Aristotle might have been wrong about a bunch of things. And insofar as medieval philosophers or Renaissance philosophers were following Aristotle and their conception of nature, it sounds like we actually might need to start over. And so so thinkers like Descartes and Hobbes and Spinoza, they said, actually, okay, so the these medieval philosophers, because they relied so heavily on the ancients, and the ancients misunderstood the nature of the universe, misunderstood the nature of things, we need to start over. We need to use reason to rebuild philosophy from the ground up, just through pure reason. Because what medieval philosophers had done is they had kind of followed this path of tradition. In this case, the tradition being what Plato and Aristotle said. And then these religious philosophers would just try to fill in any kind of impious holes or any kind of religious issues that might arise from those ancient views, and they would just try to improve on, but for the most part, stay within that kind of conceptual framework. But 17th century philosophers like Descartes and Hobbes and Spinoza, they said, okay, well, no, actually, we need to just push tradition aside. Something isn't true just because Plato said it, or something isn't true just because Aquinas or Averroes or Maimonides said it. We need to get to the real truth of things. And how do we get to the real truth of things? Reason. And so each of them, in their own distinctive ways, attempted to rebuild philosophy from the ground up by reason alone. Now, that's how they presented themselves. Obviously, in terms of being well educated, they were still heavily influenced by the ancients and by medieval philosophers.
And this is the Enlightenment period, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. Yes. And so, I mean, this is so cool. I mean, for one, thank you for laying this all out because it's so fascinating. And then, so how did Spinoza, what was his construction and how did that differ particularly from Descartes and Hobbes?
So with Hobbes, we actually get a materialistic picture of reality. So Hobbes is an empiricist. So for Hobbes, the foundation of knowledge is sense perception. And so Hobbes, from that kind of empirical foundation through sense perception, Hobbes ultimately comes to the conclusion that, well, the only thing that fundamentally exists is bodies in motion, including the mind, including any states or in particular pleasures of the mind are ultimately going to be material. They're ultimately going to be bodily motion, psychological motions. So he ends up explaining everything: the universe, human nature, human psychology, human pleasure in terms of bodily motions. Then we have Descartes, on the other hand, who's a dualist. He argues that actually human beings are made up of two distinct substances, two distinct entities or things, a soul and a body. And these things, as substances, they can exist independently of each other. Most importantly, Descartes wants to show that the mind can exist independently of the body, because this helps preserve. So Descartes was a Catholic. So this helps preserve the notion of the immortality of the soul. So Descartes argues that mind and body have distinct states, distinct pleasures as well, but then also mind and body can have certain properties in common. So, for example, sense perception only arises from the union of mind and body. Because a body without a soul can't experience sensations because it's not alive. And a soul that's not connected to a body can't physically interact with anything, and in which case it wouldn't have perceptions. So sense perception is something that's unique to a union of mind and body, whereas thinking, willing, desiring, those are properties of a mind or of a soul. Whereas size, shape, motion, touch, those are all properties, features of bodies. So that's Descartes' view. We end up having mind and body as distinct things, but in the case of human beings, mind and bodies seem to share some sort of close union to each other. They can also interact with each other. And it's a complicated question about how Descartes actually understands the relationship between mind and body, but ultimately his answer is going to be that God in some way, in some sense, unifies mind and body while still allowing the mind to exist independently of the body when the body dies. Spinoza, however, is very interesting in this case because he pushes against Hobbes's materialist view and Descartes' dualist view, and he seems to embrace what, in kind of contemporary terms, we would call an identity theory. In particular, what's really distinctive about Spinoza is that he offers a non-reductive identity theory. So what makes Spinoza, and this makes Spinoza distinctive in the history of philosophy itself, not just in the context of the early modern period. Because today, if you were to look at identity theories about mind and body, the identity theories are usually going to be, well, the mind is in some way dependent on the body for its existence, or the mind, mental states are just brain states. So usually the kind of identity theories we see now are materialistic. So similar to what Hobbes had in mind, but obviously with much more kind of sophisticated justification based on modern science that wasn't available to Hobbes. But when Spinoza says that mind and body are identical, he doesn't mean that the mind is just the body, that it's just a physical thing, nor is he saying the opposite, that the body's dependent on the mind, or the body is just a mental thing. He's saying that the mental and the bodily, or the mental and the physical, are equally constitutive of reality, that reality itself is fundamentally thinking and physical, that reality expresses itself simultaneously in both ways. So another way of putting this is that we can, another way of putting this is that the mental and the physical are just two different aspects, two strictly corresponding aspects of the same underlying thing. I think the term for this kind of view in the 20th century would be neutral monism. So reality isn't fundamentally just physical or fundamentally just mental, it's actually both, and potentially infinitely many other things as well. So Spinoza's view is very unique in this regard.
So from this, does it follow that reality cannot exist without a mind to then perceive it?
Yes. So in a lot of respects, Spinoza could be considered a panpsychist. For him, everything is thinking. You and I are obviously thinking, but so is your lamp, so is your mic, so is the window behind me, so is the wall. Now, the way that Spinoza explains this in a way that doesn't seem absurd is that while everything in reality is fundamentally thinking, not everything thinks to the same degree or with the same level of complexity. So how
does he argue like a rock would think?
So in his philosophical works, because as I said earlier, Spinoza's primary goal is to use philosophy to figure out how to live a good life. He primarily focuses on, well, how does philosophy inform how to live a good human life? And so while he does give a general, he does give a general explanation about reality, the universe, and various things, inanimate and animate, that exist in the universe, Spinoza doesn't do a deep dive into the nature of every living thing or everything that exists in the universe. So he really doesn't flesh out this kind of panpsychist dimension because he's concerned with human happiness. So for him, it's enough for us to just at least when it comes to figuring out the basic doctrines that will lead us to happiness, Spinoza isn't as concerned with figuring out the precise nature of non-human things. So he doesn't really give us these answers about like what it would look like for a rock thing. But to put it crudely, the idea would just be the rock would just have the idea of being a rock, and it would have the idea of anything that affected it.
One question I have for you is just to lay this out. So Hobbes is a materialist. I'm assuming his take on pleasure would be something along the lines of like, pleasure exists in these states. If the world around you arises something, then pleasure comes as a consequence. Is that somewhat right?
Well, so we experience pleasure. So fundamentally, Hobbes talks about how, as human beings, the fundamental psychological motions that we have are desire and aversion. Mm-hmm. So we have emotion. We have certain bodily motions that motivate us towards certain things. That's desire, and then we have certain bodily motions that motivate us away from things. That's aversion. Well, when we satisfy a desire, we experience pleasure. When we fail to satisfy a desire, we experience pain.
Yeah, and those satisfaction comes through the material. So pleasure. What I guess I'm not. But does pleasure for him still exist in the mind?
So yes. Yes, it's just for Hobbes, the mind is ultimately a material thing.
Oh, got it.
Yeah, it's just the idea is that. So just So for Hobbes, the mind is also material. The mind is also just bodily motions. So when we will something or we think something, there's some sort of bodily motion going on. Now,
Spinoza?
In Spinoza's case?
Yeah.
So in Spinoza's case, really what we have is a bunch of neutral things that we can talk about, and those things end up being expressed both physically and intellectually. So first and foremost, Spinoza says that anything that has being, anything that exists, inherently affirms its existence. So anything that exists has this internal self-preservative force. So for Spinoza, being's inherently active and self-expressive. Yeah. And for Spinoza, that's what God is a being of infinite force of existing or infinite self-expressive power. And so as individuals, we all have a certain degree of self-expressive power. And we can increase this power as well, but through beneficial things and so on. But the idea is we have this foundation of self-expressive power and as individuals. And this self-expressive power is simultaneously manifested in both physical and intellectual ways. So, for example, us talking right now can be understood in both physical terms and in mental terms. In physical terms, obviously, both of our brains are lighting up right now. Our brains are engaged in complex neurobiological processes. Our bodies are moving, in particular our tongues, to allow us to speak. There's sound waves that are traveling, and so on. Obviously, the sound waves are being picked up by the mic on this laptop as well. So all this various physical phenomena that's going on. But, and so this kind of causal interaction between us can be understood on the one hand in these physical terms, but it can also be understood in thinking terms, because I have the idea of myself speaking to you right now, and you have the idea of me speaking to you right now, and so our minds are interacting with each other as well. Our minds are interacting with each other just in the same way that our bodies are interacting with each other. In fact, on Spinoza's account, we're not actually talking about two distinct kinds of phenomena that are going on, one physical and one mental. Really, there's just one natural phenomena going on right now, but that natural phenomenon can be understood in physical terms and in mental terms. I know it's very different, because we tend to think about everything in purely materialistic terms, and similar to Hobbes, or we tend to intuitively think about things more the way that Descartes thinks about them, that our minds and bodies are distinct things, that they're separate. But that's not Spinoza's account. For Spinoza, while our mental language and our physical language, or our mental concepts and our physical concepts, are distinct ontologically or fundamentally, they're not actually two distinct things. They're just two different aspects of the same thing. And this applies to pleasure as well, because what this ultimately means is that our bodily pleasures and our mental pleasures are not distinct. We really just have one pleasure. And what pleasure is, so you asked me earlier, what is pleasure for Hobbes? Well, pleasure for Spinoza, on the other hand, is fundamentally that which promotes our self-affirmative power. So we experience pleasure when our ability to express ourselves is promoted in some way. And we experience pain when we're impeded in some way.
That's so interesting, because your definition of pleasure that I forgot, I believe that was for Hobbes, which was this idea of when you're able to achieve a desirable state, or if you're able to achieve a desire, then you're rewarded with pleasure. I feel like fits into maybe like a truly a materialist kind of mindset of the world, of like, I want a nice car. When I get the car, I feel pleasure. But I feel like the definition you gave for Spinoza seems more of the pleasure that maybe like a creative or an artist would say, where it's like, I have these feelings of desire to create something, and when I am able to actually manifest my desire in that sense, like out into the world, then I'm able to feel some sort of pleasure. Is that right?
Yeah, so I'm glad that you still use the term desire, because Spinoza will also talk about pleasure in terms of satisfying desire. But where Hobbes talks about, so for Hobbes, the foundation of desire is psychological motion. For Spinoza, the foundation of desire is self-expression. Now, Spinoza actually says that we are essentially that our essence is desire. Or more precisely, our essence is self-affirmative or self-expressive desire. And we experience desire because as individuals, so God, as a being of infinite self-expressive desire, of self-expressive power, God doesn't experience desires because God is infinite. God doesn't have any restrictions on his power. So there's nothing that he lacks that he would need. But as individuals, we're finite. We have limitations. We don't take up all of existence. We're not all powerful. And because of that, because we're inherently limited to some extent, our self-affirmative power has limitations. And because our power has limitations, that means that we necessarily desire to not only to preserve our power, but to increase our power. Because the more empowered we are, the more stably and effectively we can express ourselves. And so that's what pleasure does. Pleasure increases our capacity to express ourselves. So you're right. I think this does I think what Spinoza has in mind does, at least in a metaphorical or figurative sense, is far more reminiscent of the kind of the artist than this kind of purely mechanical materialism that we have with Hobbes.
So in studying, the thing that I'm really kind of curious to circle on is how do you feel like these, because I mean it's so fascinating because these things aren't just slight differentiations between thinking about pleasure. I mean, I think this ends up trickling down into policy, into education, into so many things in the subtle things that we talk to each other about how we ought to live our life, which in so many ways is what education comes down to. Even to me, even the act of being educated says that by being educated, you are now able to live this quote unquote better life. And so the real question is, what is it actually even about that education that allows someone to do so? And so I think, how do you feel like, because we're going to skip a couple many hundreds of years from the 17th century, but to kind of getting into the modern day, how do you feel like these remnants of these conversations around pleasure have now infiltrated how we think about pleasure today?
So I think we talked earlier about how some of these ancient ideas aren't necessarily foreign to us today. There does seem to be some common ground. And I think on the subject of pleasure, there is that common ground. For a Greek in Athens in antiquity versus for you and I today, we both, as human beings, have this natural inclination towards pleasure, whether in a physical or mental sense, or in a in a physical or mental sense, or in an artistic sense, however we want to put it. We do seem to have this general desire for pleasure, and this seems to track throughout history for human beings in general. But then the question becomes, well, what's the appropriate way to think about pleasure? Is pleasure something good, intrinsically good? Is it something intrinsically bad? Is it something that could be good or bad? Should our life just be about accumulating as many pleasures as possible, regardless of what kind of pleasure it is, or are certain pleasures better than others? And so, for example, today we tend to refer to someone as hedonistic if they're self-indulgent, if they just kind of indiscriminately enjoy pleasures. But in the ancient period, what Epicurus, for example, meant, so Epicurus argues that happiness is constituted by pleasure, that the happy life is fundamentally the pleasant life. And so Epicurus would be a hedonist, but Epicurus argues that there are different kinds of pleasures, and some pleasures are better than others. And so the kind of the two main pleasures that Epicurus talks about are actually going back to our discussion about desire. There are pleasures that we experience in the process of satisfying a desire, and then there's the pleasure that we experience in the absence of desire. So we usually think about pleasure in terms of the process of satisfying a desire, and that's what Hobbes has in mind. But the unique thing that Epicurus wants to argue is that actually there's this whole other realm of experience that's pleasant that we don't usually think of as pleasant. And so he argues that actually not being hungry, not being constipated, not being tired, not having your teeth hurt, not having any part of your body hurt, not having any psychological disturbance, basically freedom from suffering, whether in a bodily or mental sense. That also is a kind of pleasure. And Epicurus wants to argue not only is it a kind of pleasure, but it's the ultimate pleasure. It's the purest pleasure. It's basically the pleasure of unimpeded natural functioning.
Sorry, I was muted. Where would you say your research has kind of led you to? Because I mean, I think pleasure is one of those things that I find to be absolutely integral to so many things that I do. I mean, even recently, I was sober for 6 years. I recently just started drinking wine again. And even in that decision, so many of these conversations come up. To what extent is this the thing that I ought to do? Why am I doing this? Is this, and it comes up in every decision. I mean, I was tired last night. I wanted to eat some ice cream. I was like, should I? I know I shouldn't. I already brushed my teeth. I ate it. But but these conversations end up playing there. It plays, what do I do when I wake up? It kind of, the narrative we have about how important and what pleasure even is, and distinguishing perhaps pleasure from happiness, plays a role in almost for all of our decisions. And so I'm curious, for you, all your research, how do you feel like it's helped you understand pleasure better? And how do you kind of lead your own life, and how has your research influenced that?
So ultimately, on this kind of subject of pleasure, both Epicurus and Spinoza have been the very influential ones to me on this subject. Back in my undergrad, when I first learned about Epicurus and about his view of pleasure, this idea of these two different kinds of pleasure, the pleasure of satisfying desire versus the pleasure from the absence of desire. And then he draws a further distinction between necessary pleasures, the pleasures you need to function in your life, versus unnecessary pleasures, the things that are just preferential, the things that if you don't satisfy them, you could still function adequately or fully function in your life. Those kinds of distinctions really, and then, those kinds of distinctions really captured me. And I thought it's such a simple distinction, but it's such a helpful, very instructive way of thinking about pleasure. Really, this idea of that the purest pleasure is just being physically and mentally healthy. That's the real pleasure. Like, that's the ultimate pleasure. It's just being physically and mentally healthy. Makes a lot of sense. We tend to try to overcomplicate our lives. And human beings are complicated. We can't deny that. But sometimes we can overcomplicate things and get confused about what is really true to us as human beings and what is more a matter of convention. And so I think Epicurus was really helpful to me in really starting to think about that separation between nature and convention. And then when I started writing my paper on Spinoza and Epicurus, and I really started to realize, when Epicurus says that pleasure is good, the reason he thinks pleasure is good is because he connects pleasure to our natural functioning, to being healthy. And I had never thought of, I had always thought about pleasure as just pleasant sensations or pleasant emotions, similar to the kind of Stoic view. But I never really had thought about pleasure as this kind of fundamental aspect of functioning. That pleasure is actually is a key feature of what it means to function. And whereas pain is a key feature of what it means to fail to function or to be in a dysfunctional state. And so if I hadn't come across Spinoza, I'd be an Epicurean right now, and most of our discussion would be about Epicureanism. But what I found fascinating in Spinoza is he also links together healthy being, pleasure, and goodness. For him, pleasure is intrinsically good because it's connected to healthy being. In this case, because it's connected to our self-affirmative power. But, and that's the key thing, because Spinoza understands us as essentially as self-expressive beings, as beings with self-expressive power, he adds in a dimension to this discussion of pleasure as healthy being that Epicurus doesn't, and that's activity. So for Epicurus, the happy life is just being physically and mentally healthy. It doesn't actually matter if you engage in any kind of physical and intellectual activities. Those things are just preferential pleasures for Epicurus. You can just you just need to be physically and mentally healthy. Anything that you do beyond that is just preferential. But what Spinoza captures that I think is also important here is we're inherently active beings. So it's not enough to just be unimpeded in our functioning. To really flourish, to live well, we have to express ourselves. And so it isn't just that pleasure promotes healthy being, it also promotes healthy activities, physically and intellectually. So for me, Spinoza added this further dimension that I think is more indicative of the complexity of human nature, which is healthy being, pleasure, goodness, and activity.
So he's saying, Spinoza, it seems like, is saying that when a person is in the experience of pleasure, which that in itself, it's a moral good. I guess a question that I have, or something that just came up, is, I don't know, let's say you're an emperor and you're looking to expand your territory and you end up, obliterating, millions of people as you continue and you feel some sort of pleasure from the growth of your empire. How would Spinoza maybe define that as like maybe a moral good?
Good. So, because this is also could be like very much a worry about Spinoza. If he's making pleasure and happiness about power, doesn't that kind of seem like he would encourage subjugating other people? Because obviously, if you're a tyrant and you're able to subjugate other people, destroy other civilizations, wouldn't that seem like the ultimate expression of power, the ability to subjugate and destroy others? But in fact, that Spinoza actually thinks that that's a weak expression of power. And what makes it a weak expression of power is it's not a sustainable expression of power. Because if you engage in, if you express your power through harming others, then that creates conflict and disunity that's actually incredibly risky and harmful to your own continued self-empowerment. Because historically we see what happens to tyrants. Eventually, either the people rise up and take out the tyrant, or another tyrant, or other political leaders will eventually rise up against them. So tyranny doesn't pay as an expression of power because it's not sustainable. The real expression of power, or a true sustainable expression of power, is found through unity and connection and solidarity. And so when Spinoza talks about self-empowerment, when Spinoza talks about virtue and morality, he very much emphasizes that the way that the most effective way to preserve our power and the healthiest pleasures that follow from promoting that power are those that unite us with other human beings, those that promote community and solidarity and agreement in nature. So he very much argues that he argues that while obviously individual human beings will have some differences from each other, we are also all human. And when we focus on our common ground as human beings, that gives us a stable and sustainable foundation for promoting our empowerment, because by collaborating with each other, we both become more empowered. I learn from you, you learn from me. We're both more intellectually powerful because of this podcast, because of our discussion right now, than we would be if I just kept my knowledge to myself and you just kept your knowledge to yourself. So Spinoza very much hones in on the idea that power is maximized and sustained through agreement and unity rather than through subjugation.
Can I ask a quick question?
Comes in. Yeah, go for it.
So, like, let's say, for example, through this perspective, let's say there's two individuals and they both follow two separate ethical frameworks. And they both say, when you act in this ethical way, in all these ways, pleasure is a natural consequence. And perhaps it really is in those particular contexts as well, because an example that comes to my mind is when you act in certain ways that are considered to be socially acceptable in one country, you'll be socially rewarded for doing those things. But when you move to a different country or context, even if the morality is 180, if you follow those, that could lead to pleasure. But that doesn't say anything about the actual action itself, right? Like, it just seems like if I just say whatever is I consider to be moral, and I just say if you do these things in this context, pleasure will arise, can't you replace that with anything that leads to pleasure?
So again, here's where it's a good question, and it's an important question and concern, but here again is why it's important, and this is something both Epicurus and Spinoza agree on, is that not only are there different kinds of pleasures, but there's also a hierarchy of pleasures, that some pleasures are better than other pleasures. So in this kind of scenario, we're not just talking about if we value pleasure as something intrinsically good, we're not just talking about, well, whatever action is going to give us pleasure. We want to hone in on, well, which actions give which kinds of pleasures and which actions give the best kinds of pleasures. And the best kinds of pleasures are going to be those that promote one's health overall, not the health of one part of your life, but the health of your life overall. Again, going back to this notion of happiness is something that's structurally stable. It's not just about one moment in your life or one dimension of your life. It's about your life as a whole. So on this kind of question of pleasure, we want to structure our life around those actions and pleasures that promote the overall well-being of one's life, rather than just particular dimensions of that life.
And I feel like maybe even this conception of pleasure also places it in a positive framework, where I feel like oftentimes there can be so much shame around the feeling of pleasure, but it's nice to even view it as this kind of thing. I mean, I feel that too sometimes, where when I feel good, I sometimes feel a sense of like shame, like, should I really be feeling this happy? Like, do I deserve to feel this good? But I think like this type of framing of pleasure as like a consequence of just a healthy life also just makes you feel like it's something that is not a bad thing to experience.
Absolutely. And the obvious kind of counter argument to this is, well, but don't people experience pleasures all the time that are unhealthy for them? People, like, addiction is an obvious example, because people don't become addicts if they only experienced pain or discomfort. You become an addiction forms because you experience some sort of pleasure from doing that. Well, doesn't that kind of seem like an obvious example? The Stoic, for example, would say, well, isn't that kind of an obvious example that not all pleasures are good? Heroin seems to cause pleasure, but we know that heroin is terrible for your health. Well, the crucial thing that both Epicurus and Spinoza want to say is, when we actually delve into pleasure scientifically and understand where it's coming from, we'll see that in those instances where a pleasure is unhealthy, where does it become unhealthy? It becomes unhealthy when it leads to pain. So what does that actually mean? It means the pleasure actually leads to its own destruction. So pleasure is intrinsically good, and it's only ever bad when it's self-destructive, or when it's enjoyed in a self-destructive way. So the pleasure that heroin is giving you is it's stimulating certain parts of your brain, certain parts of your body that under normal circumstances would be a good thing. But but in this case, because heroin also carries all these harmful consequences centered around stimulating your brain and your body in that way, that kind of pleasure ends up being short-lived and not particularly helpful to you in the long run. So a key thing that I wanted to emphasize here is, I think you're right that both Epicurus and Spinoza want to give us this overarching positive view of pleasure, but they also want to recognize that our cultivation of pleasures can also be harmful and dangerous if we misunderstand what makes things, the reason that things are pleasant for us, if we misunderstand the nature of a particular pleasure. So if you misunderstand why heroin is pleasant for you, or why eating a Big Mac at McDonald's might nourish you, but might not be the best form of nourishment for you. Things like that. So they both really emphasize understanding why we experience pleasure for the things that we experience. Because if we understand that, then we can cultivate pleasures in the correct way, and we can prioritize these pleasures and enjoy these various pleasures in correct ways. Because there's something wrong. There is something, definitely shouldn't do heroin. But there are other ways to get that kind of positive stimulation that someone might get from heroin from other things that are healthier.
Yeah. Or I guess he would say
Similarly,
you shouldn't do, I guess Spinoza would say you shouldn't do heroin destructively.
That's a good question. In the early modern period, they certainly didn't have the medical worries about alcohol and drugs that we have now, because the kind of rich understanding of how those things affect the human body. Are there things that function similarly to heroin that could be healthy in some fashion? Maybe. Heroin itself, I don't know, even on Spinoza's account, whether it's a good question. I don't know. There might be some rare circumstance in which heroin could be useful and empowering, but it would be in a very rare circumstance where heroin would be something you should cultivate for your empowerment.
Yeah. The difficult thing I find to be, I mean, even with alcohol, is, and this is where I'm a little confused. I'm curious what you think. Alcohol, for example, in the United States serves for social connection. It serves all these things where it's deeply tied to the culture that drinking might come with a lot of benefits. Where if you're like in Saudi or something, drinking no longer comes with any of those benefits. And so in that environment, so it feels like a lot of these definitions of pleasure, though, are so socially constrained. It's not, you can't, is it possible to kind of separate from that? Because you can't say anything specifically about any behavior then. And maybe they're not trying to do that.
So here we run into a kind of fundamental debate and issue, or potential issue, which is, when it comes to these ancient philosophers and these 17th century philosophers, or at least many of them, certainly Epicurus and Spinoza, they want to give an objective account of the happy life. They want to give an account of the happy life that is grounded objectively in human nature and thus would apply to all human beings, regardless of what society they've grown up in, what culture they've internalized. This is the correct way to live. Now, they might allow for the way in which you achieve that state of being, the way you achieve happiness might be practically different or circumstantially different because you're growing up in a different society. But the end goal itself is going to be the same for everyone. And any culture or any society that would steer you away from that would be acting against your interests, but also arguably its own interests, if you consider a state or a society to be something that also wants to promote its own well-being. So an effective state is going to be a state that is in harmony with the well-being and happiness of its citizens. But this is where the issue comes in, is a lot, particularly nowadays, a lot of people feel like when we're talking about the meaning of life or the good life or happiness, that it's a largely, if not wholly, subjective matter. It's entirely up to someone's beliefs and feelings, or it's relative to their society or their culture, which I think you have nicely brought to the forefront here. So that's a complicated thing. The fact that Epicurus and Spinoza want to offer an objective account of the good life could be seen as very problematic to a lot of people today. In fact, when I've taught students over the last few years, and I've talked about happiness and the good life and the meaning of life, oftentimes, particularly students who are just starting at university, who are in their first or second year of their undergrad, most of them tend to be quite subjectivist and quite relativist about things. They'll say, well, yeah, no, you can't tell someone what happiness is, because happiness is ultimately up to each individual person. But, and this is a whole other conversation that we can have, there are reasons that Epicurus and Spinoza have for thinking that that kind of purely subjective approach isn't particularly helpful.
Yeah, I mean, just for the sake of discussion, at the very least, I mean, to just be like it's up to each individual doesn't actually, yeah, allow you, especially when you're thinking about things from a policy perspective, or you got to have some kind of framing or understanding. And so, I want to leave you with this last question, which I'm really curious to understand, which is tying together pleasure and meaning. Would some people argue that feeling like your life has meaning is essential to then experience pleasure? And I'm assuming other people would say the other way, that if meaning is the highest thing to aim for, then pleasure is an important aspect to then feel like your life has meaning. And so, how does one distinguish what is the highest thing to aim for? Meaning or pleasure?
Yeah, great. And actually, I'm glad you asked this question because it ties in nicely with what we were just talking about. Because while both Epicurus and Spinoza want to talk about the meaning of life or happiness in this objective way, they also, because they think pleasure is intrinsically good and is a core dimension of happiness, they also want to emphasize that that happiness is also subjective. So the interesting thing that they want to say is that happiness, the meaning of life, or the good life is something that's both objective and subjective. It's objective in the sense that it's grounded in certain definitive facts about human nature, about human functioning. But it's also subjective because happiness or living a good life isn't like the laws of physics. Gravity holds whether or not you and I are aware of the existence of gravity, or whatever we think or feel, believe or feel, gravity still exists. But is it really right to say that someone's happy if they don't believe or feel that they're happy? So we can distinguish between happiness, between one's beliefs and feelings as a necessary condition for happiness and a sufficient condition for happiness. So happiness is necessarily partly subjective, because if you don't believe you're happy and feel you're happy, particularly experience pleasure in your life, then you can't be happy. That's why it's necessary. But it's not sufficient, because simply believing or feeling that you're happy doesn't always guarantee that you are indeed happy. So on the one hand, you can never be blindly happy. You can't be living a good life and not a truly good life and not be aware of it. But on the other hand, you can be mistaken about being happy if you don't have the right justification for why the life that you're living is the correct way to live. So on this kind of on this subject of the relationship between pleasure and meaning, in some respects, it depends on the view that you have. For someone like Epicurus, or in some respects Spinoza, they're going to say, well, the meaning of life is pleasure, or more specifically, a certain kind of pleasure. So the ultimate standard of meaning is pleasure. But then other thinkers, so like the Stoics also think that a happy life is going to be pleasant, but they don't think that pleasure is what constitutes happiness. They think that pleasure is just, or rational pleasure is something that's just a symptom or an effect after you've already achieved happiness. So it's this kind of, so there, when it comes to this question of the relationship between pleasure and the meaning of life, there are kind of, in general, most people seem to agree that pleasure is going to be a necessary aspect of it, but necessary in what sense? Is pleasure going to be the source of meaning? Or is it just going to be the effect, the symptom of having achieved meaning?
I mean, I feel like these conversations, one, I just want to thank you so much for joining us, because I mean, I think this was the first episode where we really kind of laid down this foundation and framework for a historical perspective on pleasure. And I think because we didn't tie it to education, which I'm excited to do in future episodes, it can be tough to maybe necessarily identify that connection. But I mean, this stuff is so deeply tied into how a teacher even approaches why someone should learn something, what the point of the education is, what the goal of any of this is, and how to think about it. And so I think even understanding historically how different things have changed, starting from pre-Socratics, moving to the Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, and then moving into the Stoics, and then eventually into these later philosophers. I mean, it's been a true journey. So I just want to say thank you for one, knowing so much about this, which is amazing. I one day yearn to like get to a place in my life where I can speak this in depth. And I probably only scratched the surface for how much you could talk about this.
Yeah, I have only scratched the surface.
I know, yeah. I mean, so it's, I mean, I would love to, I mean, I think that's the power of PhDs in the university, and I would love to one day be able to speak this in depthly about anything but education in specific. But I want to say thank you so much for coming and sharing all your insight today.
Oh, and thank you very much for the opportunity. This was a wonderful theme, and I wish you the best of luck with your subsequent discussions. I'll definitely be tuning in.
Oh, I want to say thank you all for listening. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. We have a few more episodes before we close off this season. I hope you're having a great week, and as per usual, stay re-educated.